We're mostly friends here. I'm glad to see everybody who came out. This is a Friday night, I realize. But, you know, if you decided to come to hear the talk tonight, you made a really good choice. I do want to welcome you to the final night of the Faith, Film, Philosophy 2025 series of events. I'm David Calhoun, Director of the Gonzaga Faith and Reason Institute. The Institute seeks to develop an integrationist understanding of faith and reason, particularly as it's articulated in the Catholic intellectual tradition, and as it's found in issues such as faith and science, philosophical theology, reflection on evil and suffering, and the cultural and social impact of Christianity. Activities organized by the Faith and Reason Institute are financially supported by the Father Robert J. Spitzer Society of Jesus Leadership Fund, which honors the former president and co-founder, I should say former president of Gonzaga. I didn't mean the president of the United States, but anyway. Former Gonzaga president and co-founder of the Institute, Father Robert J. Spitzer. The Institute is deeply grateful for the support of the donors and benefactors who have contributed to this fund and to the Institute over the years. We're indebted to all of them for the gifts that make events like tonight's talk possible. I'm going to take a minute just to let you know we've enjoyed a bounty of events this week, starting on Monday night with a faculty panel, followed by a student panel on Tuesday, a talk on the films of Christopher Nolan by film scholar and blogger Joel Mayward from George Fox University, back here in the back, on Wednesday night, and a talk by distinguished Catholic author, scholar, teacher, and administrator from Baylor University, Tom Hibbs, last night on the film Blue by auteur-director Krzysztof Kieslowski. In addition to all of these public activities, a group of scholars has been engaged today in the first day of the Faith, Film, Philosophy 2025 seminar, which gathers together scholars of film and popular culture to talk about each other's work. So lots of fun. We have enjoyed a bounty, I would say. For the final night of the series, our guest speaker will address the nihilism in David Fincher's 1995 thriller Seven. Vernon W. Cisney is chair and associate professor of interdisciplinary studies and is a contributing faculty member in philosophy and cinema and media studies and Jewish studies at Gettysburg College in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Cisney's research and teaching emphasizes the intersections of philosophy, religion, literature, cinema, the sciences, and political philosophy, with particular focus on contemporary continental philosophy, philosophy of film, and philosophy of literature. He was telling me about a course he's going to teach on Dostoevsky next year.
Yeah, next year.
And several of us were very envious. It sounded like a great fun. Thematically, Cisney is concerned with questions pertaining to the nature of and relations between difference and identity, the nature of selfhood, and literature's power to transform the world, and the intersections of ontology, agency, aesthetics, and social and political practice. Cisney has written and co-edited several books on Deleuze and Derrida, co-edited The Way of Nature and The Way of Grace, Philosophical Footholds on Terrence Malick's Tree of Life, which was published by Northwestern University Press back in 2016. Quite an accomplishment. Again, that's something to be proud of. And published papers and book chapters on filmmakers such as David Fincher and Paul Schrader. Cisney has participated in faith, film, and philosophy on several occasions and also has organized a similar event at Gettysburg College. I didn't have this in my notes, but when he did, was it on Malick?
Yes.
Yeah, so he did a similar thing to faith, film, philosophy on Terrence Malick, and I thought, I cannot pass that up. So I went and enjoyed it, and it was a great experience. So given all these interests and areas of expertise, Vern is an excellent speaker to cap our week of events. So I really want to say thank you, and please join me in welcoming Vern to present his talk, We Are Not What Was Intended, The Failed Nihilism of David Fincher 7.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you all for coming out. I know it's a Friday night. There are probably things you'd rather be doing, so I really appreciate your being here. I'd like to begin by thanking David and the folks at the Faith and Reason Institute here at Gonzaga for inviting me to give this talk. As David said, I first participated in the FFP in October of 2013 when I responded to a call for papers on the Terrence Malick film, The Tree of Life. And it was the most enriching and fulfilling conference experience I'd ever had. It inspired me to launch my own conference series on film and philosophy, and it was modeled almost entirely after the FFP. I stole it almost entirely. And since that first conference here, I've participated a number of times. I've kind of lost count, I think, and my experiences have always been amazing. So the FFP is very near and dear to my heart, and I'm extremely grateful and honored to be asked to speak. We've already heard two really excellent public talks over the past two nights, so I want to say thank you to Joel and Tom for setting the bar so high and intimidating the hell out of me. And we've heard some wonderful talks today as well, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow. So the title of my talk is We Are Not What Was Intended, The Failed Nihilism of David Fincher 7. So I want to open with a passage from a French philosopher, Jean-Francois Lyotard. In his 1988 work, The Inhuman Reflections on Time, Lyotard writes, "While we talk, the sun is getting older. It will explode in 4.5 billion years. It's just a little beyond the halfway point of its expected lifetime. It's like a man in his early 40s with a life expectancy of 80. With the sun's death, your insoluble questions will be done with too. It's possible they'll stay unanswered right up to the end, flawlessly formulated, though now both grounds for raising such questions as well as the place to do this will no longer exist. You explain, it's impossible to think an end, pure and simple, of anything at all, since the end's a limit, and to think it you have to be on both sides of that limit. So what's finished or finite has to be perpetuated in our thought if it's to be thought of as finished. Now this is true of limits belonging to thought. But after the sun's death, there won't be a thought to know that its death took place. The solar explosion won't be due to human war. It won't leave behind it a devastated human world, dehumanized, but with nonetheless at least a single survivor, someone to tell the story of what's left, write it down. Dehumanized still implies human, a dead human, but conceivable, because dead in human terms, still capable of being sublated in thought. But in what remains after the solar explosion, there won't be any humanness. There won't be living creatures. There won't be intelligent, sensitive, sentient earthlings to bear witness to it, since they and their earthly horizon will have been consumed. The sun, our earth, and your thought will have been no more than a spasmodic state of energy, an instant of established order, a smile on the surface of matter in a remote corner of the cosmos. Now I wanted to start us off with a passage that was really hopeful and uplifting, as this passage so clearly is, because we're going to be talking about the 1995 David Fincher film 7, and 7 is not exactly a sunny film. So I'm going to leave the passage up here for a minute so you can continue to sort of soak it in. In this passage, Lyotard is giving voice to the notion of ultimate oblivion, the scientifically grounded eventuality of the annihilation of everything we now consider meaningful, not only meaningful as such, but as providing the very substance from which anything like meaning is able to be constructed at all. It will, all of it, be gone one day. All of our efforts will return to the dust of the stars, and the cosmos will erase every trace of our ever having existed. And so lurking within this notion of oblivion is the corollary of nihilism, the ultimate meaninglessness and valuelessness of everything, a sort of cosmic expression of Macbeth's timeless soliloquy that life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Lyotard's passage eloquently contextualizes the problem with which this film wrestles, the problem of nihilism. This year marks the 30th anniversary of Fincher's film, last month in fact. And for me at least, these sorts of anniversaries can have the tendency to provoke reflection. So when David invited me to give this talk, I had already begun thinking a little bit more deeply about this film. I didn't see the film in theaters, and by the time it was released in video stores in late spring 1996, the line, "What's in the box?" had become something of a cultural phenomenon. And so, like everyone else, I just had to know what's in the box. I was only 19 years old at the time. Yeah, I'm old, I know. But Seven hit me like a punch to my soul. It quickly became one of my favorite films, and at the time I had difficulty putting into precise words what exactly it was that I found so compelling. But in retrospect, it seems to me that it became one of my favorite films for 3 reasons. First, I had an enormous man crush on Brad Pitt at the time, coming off his calendar model performances in Interview with the Vampire and Legends of the Fall. I mean, come on, that's a pretty man. A shitty person, but a pretty man, right? And that was at least part of it. But more seriously, the film boasts an incredibly tight economical plot, by which I mean not only that it lacks extraneous narrative and filler, coming in at a runtime of just over 2 hours, nor even simply the meticulous attention paid to the smallest details, such as the wealth of information provided in the mass of artifacts arrayed in John Doe's apartment, or the extensive scrawlings visible in his many composition books. This is all part of it, of course, but the tightness that I am referring to has to do with the way that the overall structure of John Doe's project comes together almost perfectly. We see this, for instance, in the way the slivers of linoleum fed to the gluttony victim lead Detective Somerset to pull the refrigerator away from the wall, exposing the word gluttony, scrawled in grease, along with the Milton quote hanging on a nail. Long is the way and hard that out of hell leads up to light. It is this discovery that first signals to Detective Somerset that a larger vision is underway. We see the cohesion in the fact that the murder of Eli Gould, the Greed murder, provides detectives Mills and Somerset with the clue of Gould's wife's sight, which leads them to the inverted painting in Gould's office, which leads them to the fingerprints of Victor Allen, the sloth victim, leading them to discover Victor's grotesquely atrophied body exactly 1 year to the day after he had first been bound to the bed by Doe. And you notice I didn't put a picture of Victor up close. You're welcome. This speaks to how patiently, methodically, and perfectly Doe had planned and executed his vision. We see this cohesion in the way that Doe tempts Mills into assisting with the completion of Doe's vision. Doe reading Mills' character well enough to understand that A, Mills would not be able to resist the offer of Doe's full confession in exchange for the trip into the desert to locate the final 2 victims, which is necessary in order to present Doe's completed picture, and B, Mills would not be able to resist the temptation to summarily execute Doe when he discovered that Doe had been responsible for Tracy's murder, which is necessary to complete the picture in the first place. We even see it in the way that Doe skillfully lures Mills into a state of heightened agitation in the car on the way to the desert site, with Doe looking playfully at Somerset in the rearview mirror, and that's what that top scene is, that top shot, signaling to Somerset that he's deliberately baiting Mills, and reveling in the fact that Mills is taking that bait perfectly. It's an elaborate game of cat and mouse where it's never clear who is the cat and who the mouse. Nearly every detail is precisely timed, measured, and executed by Doe so that the detectives find exactly what Doe wants them to find at precisely the moment of his choosing. And this brings me to the final reason that Seven became and remains one of my favorite movies. And it's connected to the purity and simplicity of the villain and the character of John Doe himself. I can't recall a movie villain whose character was more intentionally shrouded in mystery than the character of John Doe, although I was thinking in Joel's talk the other night about the Joker from The Dark Knight. He might be a competitor too. More often than not, writers and directors provide, at minimum, the outline of a backstory or character identity that frames the origins of the narrative in something at least comprehensible, if not downright relatable. Darth Vader, for instance, turns to the dark side from his very human fear of losing the woman he loves and the child she carries. And to be sure, most of the time, such a backstory constitutes a significant core of the narrative, without which the story would appear groundless and incomplete. But John Doe has no such identity, nothing that would provide us with any clues as to his provenance or the contours of his personality that might have been warped so as to lead him to his murderous designs. There's nothing noteworthy about his appearance, no photos in his apartment other than the ones that he has taken that are tied to his murders, no known criminal record, nothing. Doe slices the skin from his fingers to remove his fingerprints and has clearly done so for many years, as the police are unable to find even a single fingerprint in his apartment. As the nameless police captain Arlie Ermey says, about the only thing we know about that guy right now is he's independently wealthy, well-educated, and totally insane. His very name is an indication of this emptiness, John Doe, a name of namelessness, used to identify a male figure when no other identifiers exist, a signifier for the proverbial everyman. Somerset points out that he's John Doe by choice. The entirety of John Doe's character is tied up with the execution of his vision. This absence of any discernible identity pertaining to John Doe suggests that he is best understood not as a traditional movie villain, but rather as something of an archetype. In this case, the concrete embodiment of human evil. An evil, we should note, that is rooted in a skewed conception of the good. And it's crucial to insist on this element that it is human evil that Doe represents. Not evil in a cosmic or supernatural sense, just good old-fashioned human evil. This obsessively perfect execution of the vision is tied to the emptiness of Doe's character, and this emptiness is further exemplified in the fact that Kevin Spacey's identity and name were left out of all advertisements for the film. This points us to a larger sense of the film itself, that it is perhaps something more than just a neo-noir detective thriller. It certainly is a neo-noir detective thriller and plays on all the familiar tropes of such films, the repeated shots and contemplation of the decay of American life and the apparent apathy that permeates the environment, the heavy reliance on shadows, gloom, and darkness, including the seemingly constant rain, the obsessive zeal with which the detectives pursue the killer, a zeal that only intensifies with each dead end they encounter, and most prominently the well-worn trope of the newly partnered detective team consisting of the younger, headstrong idealist and the jaded, disillusioned, world-weary superior who, to paraphrase another example of such a pairing, is getting too old for this shit. We even have the stereotypical aesthetic of the Detective Somerset in his trench coat and fedora. The only thing missing is his calabash pipe. The film undeniably employs these familiar tropes, and it even capitalizes on the wildly popular 90s film trope of the twist ending. But the role of the villain as an archetype of evil rather than any old run-of-the-mill killer suggests that the film aspires to something more ambitious and deliberate. A suspicion further reinforced by the namelessness of the city as well as of the police captain. Key elements of the film's milieu that remain in the abstract, acting almost as the umwelt of a thought experiment where a larger contemplation may unfold. 7 is a meditation on negation and the negative, and on whether, how, and where we might look for hope or purpose in a world that seems so consistently and obviously bereft of meaning, and tempts us constantly with the allure of apathy or contempt. It is a film that considers deeply and carefully the temptations of nihilism in contemporary American life, and it pulls no punches in doing so. And it does this through the dynamics obtaining between the 3 primary characters of the film, John Doe, David Mills, and William Somerset. This challenging confrontation with the negative is intrinsically bound up with the character of Doe. Doe presents us with a conception of selfhood that arises from this ethically vacuous landscape, a kenotic conception of self-emptying rooted in his perverse framework of Christian morality. Doe then acts as a stimulant to the ongoing philosophical debate between Mills and Somerset over the appropriate response to the seemingly endless parade of horrors that surround us on a constant basis. In what follows, I explore Seven's confrontation with nihilism along with Doe's proposed kenoticism in order to, I hope, demonstrate how his view ultimately undermines itself. I begin by fleshing out the concept of nihilism just a little bit with some historical and philosophical context. Then I use the concept to characterize the moral landscape of Seven, exploring in depth the philosophical conflict between Doe and Detective Somerset. In particular, Somerset's comportment of resignation as opposed to Doe's annihilation. I ultimately argue that Doe's kenoticism fails, thus undermining the nihilistic attitude that pervades the entire film, and that it makes a gesture, however slight, in the direction of hope. So So I want to start with this term nihilism. I got a little bit of, philosophical history here, and I apologize for that. Nihilism is rooted in this Latin word nihil, meaning nothing. And in its broadest possible framing, we can think of nihilism as a philosophical orientation rooted in the comportment of negation. It's coined in 1799 by German philosopher and literary figure Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi. The term nihilism arises in the context of Jacobi's criticisms of the early landscape of transcendental idealism, the most famous representatives of which are Immanuel Kant and Johann Fichte. Transcendental idealism, articulated by Kant in his 1781 masterpiece Critique of Pure Reason, is an effort to salve the philosophical fissure between the 17th century rationalists like René Descartes and Gottfried Leibniz, who believed in innate ideas that are stamped on the soul in virtue of the fact that it's a soul. Through these innate ideas, the world is known if it can be known at all. And then the empiricists on the other side, such as John Locke and David Hume, who rejected that ideas were innate, holding that all of our ideas originate or arise from experience. This fissure can be summed up in the difficulty in ever having knowledge of a world external to our subjectivity, and a concomitant struggle over the shape that knowledge might take. Again, I'm sorry. This is Kant. It's freaking boring. I'm sorry. Kant addresses this by positing a distinction between what he calls the noumenon, the thing in itself, and the phenomenon, the thing as it appears. For Kant, the things in the external world are, in themselves, utterly inaccessible to our intuition. And anything we might hope to say about the external world and its objects, including even their spatio-temporal determinations, will rely entirely upon the structures of the mind that is intuiting them. It is the rationally structured understanding that constitutes our world of experience. Hence the designation of transcendental idealism, indicating that our ideas, or the structures of our reason, provide the conditions of possibility for all experience, which is, the word transcendental. Johann Fichte, Kant's contemporary / successor, will then double down on this transcendental component of Kant's idealist project, identifying as an absolute, primary, and unconditioned intuition the self's conscious awareness of itself, but not as an existent thing, as Descartes had imagined, but rather as pure activity. The self for Fichte is something akin to Aristotle's unmoved mover, aware of itself in its state of being aware of itself. And the substance of its contents exist not as the necessary condition of that awareness, nor as its correlate, but rather as its creation. He thus pushes Kant's idealism to the point that things of the external world become themselves constituted by the thinking self. Friedrich Jacobi writes his famous letter to Fichte in 1799, and his criticism of the idealist program is that this idealism cannot get off the ground except by way of a radical abstraction of thought from the external world, effectively neutralizing the existence of that world, or negating it. Transcendental idealism might be capable of constructing what Jacobi calls truth, in the sense of certainty, because it stays entirely within the interior experience of the subject. But we ought not be concerned merely with truth in this philosophical sense, Jacobi thinks, but with the true, which he defines as, quote, something which is prior to and outside knowledge, that which first gives a value to knowledge and to the faculty of knowledge to reason. The encounter with the true is, for Jacobi, the moment of revelation, a moment where the unforeseeable and ultimately elusive ineffable presents itself to us. An aspect of being that by necessity is incapable of being grasped or comprehended. Comprehended literally meaning being taken in the hands by us. It is the true that calls to the thinker and sets them on the path of thinking. This takes place in utterly banal ways, like the revelation of entities and a world outside of myself, but it also occurs in the holiest and most profound ways as well, as Jacobi will hold that just as Plato identifies in the Republic, the soul of the human is marked with a vague sense of the highest good, a good that is beyond the self, and it is this good drawing us to the highest heights of the soul, without which human reason, he thinks, including the reason that guides the idealist project, would not be possible at all. The idealist will grasp at truth, but only by negating what he calls the true. In a formulation I rather like, he says, every philosophy without exception is at some point marked by a miracle. The idealist, and in particular of the Fichtean sort, is above all an idolater, he says, inasmuch as they suppose themselves to be the intellectual creator of their own reality. But further, insofar as they assume that the concepts of their creation are to be considered sacrosanct. But moreover, the idealist is, he says, a nihilist, insofar as the triumph of their reason relies entirely upon the negation of the true, of the world and of anything higher than the self, which we recall Fichte takes to be absolute. Truly, my dear Fichte, I would not be vexed if you or anyone else were to call chimerism the view, which, by the way, Fichte uses this word chimeras to describe the things in themselves in the science of knowledge. Call chimerism the view I oppose to the idealism that I chide for nihilism. It is nihilistic because it strips the value from the world and places it entirely in the knowing subject. Jacobi would unfortunately be dismissed by later philosophers as an irrationalist and a fideist. But his term, nihilism, would become, by the end of the 19th century, a household name. Following Jacobi's formulation, the ethos of nihilism would then be popularized in Russian culture, first in a positive way in the writings of anarchist Mikhail Bakunin as a radical program dedicated to the total destruction of the existing socio-political order, and then as the object of critique by writers such as Ivan Turgenev and Fyodor Dostoevsky, who connected this destructive political impulse to the aristocratic philosophical effort at westernizing Russian culture at the expense of its own cultural, ethical, and religious roots. So in their writings, Turgenev and Dostoevsky, nihilism morphs from the negation and destruction of the world to the dissolution of all foundations of value, which we should note, terrifies them. And this brings us to the figure whose name is probably more closely associated with nihilism than any other, German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who would incorporate aspects of all of these various framings. So in his 1882 work, The Gay Science, Nietzsche famously presents the parable of the madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, "I seek God, I seek God." After suffering the ridicule of his listeners, the madman launches into an impassioned sermon. Where is he? I will tell you, we have killed him, you and I. And are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. Now, this is likely one of the more recognizable passages in the history of Western thought, but it's also likely one of the most misunderstood. Nietzsche is not merely saying, as I was first taught this passage, that God does not exist. He's not making a claim about the factical existence or non-existence of a being we call God. But more importantly, he is not simply saying, in the register of the so-called new atheists like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens, that the Christian religion specifically and the concept of God more generally have been debunked, let us say, by reason and the sciences, and that they are now the preoccupations only of the fool who simply needs to get in line with the obvious intellectual superiority of Enlightenment rationality. No, Nietzsche's concerns are far more expansive. Similar to Jacobi, Nietzsche will understand the idealism of the 19th century, and in particular in its Kantian form, as nihilistic, but for slightly different reasons. Where Jacobi would worry that idealism negated the external world, Nietzsche would argue that by placing the ultimate ground of our experience in a domain that is wholly inaccessible to us, for Kant, that of the noumenon, or the thing of itself, a thing in itself, Kant was crystallizing a philosophical gesture that Nietzsche is going to trace all the way back to Plato. A moment ago we noted that Fichte doubles down on Kant's idealism. But the radical subjectivity that Kant establishes doesn't arise in a vacuum. It is in part a response to the epistemological revolution issued by René Descartes in the early 17th century, when Descartes, in an effort to ground the sciences in pure mathematics, posits human ideas as the necessary lenses through which the sciences must be conducted. This would come to be known as the way of ideas and would structure epistemological reflection for the next several centuries up to arguably the present. But Descartes' impulse is, in its own way, a radicalization of Plato, who held that our knowledge of the world must be grounded in the realm of the eidos, or the forms, or the ideas. The world, Plato argued, was in constant flux, and hence was in itself unknowable, unless that knowledge is grounded in the eternal and unchanging, which is transcendent to the world, strictly speaking. Nietzsche outlines this progression in a passage titled, "How the True World Finally Became a Fable." For Plato, the transcendent, that is the form of the good, is, with tremendous effort and dedication, accessible in this life. Granted, it takes several decades of dedicated philosophical discipline, but the philosopher can eventually glimpse it in this life. The Christian adaptation of this will defer that access to the ultimate ground of value until the next life. St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known." This trajectory would reach its crescendo in the era of idealism, as that ultimate ground for Kant, the noumenal realm, is no longer accessible to experience at all. Nietzsche writes that that nihilism means that the highest values devalue themselves. So for Nietzsche, Jacobi's critiques apply not just to the idealists of his day, but to the entire tradition out of which idealism had emerged. The value of this life in the tradition of Western philosophy has been almost entirely grounded upon a realm of value that exists outside of this life, indicating for Nietzsche that this life as such has no immanent value of its own. This is what Nietzsche means when he says that we are the ones who have killed God. Little by little, Western philosophy has deposited more and more of its basis of value in something transcendent to experience, until it has finally slipped away entirely. To paraphrase a line from Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards, it is as if we have progressively put all of our value eggs in one basket, and now we've blown up the basket. Now, Nietzsche thinks that there's likely some positive potential in this, as he thinks that once we acknowledge this epochal shift, we can then take the reins in creating new values. But for the time being, we are treading on truly terrifying terrain. For while it's true that the values of the West were always inherently nihilistic for Nietzsche, at least there was a foundation of value, however tenuous, however life-denying. But now even that foundation is gone, and with it gone, we're entering a period of absolute groundlessness. And worse, because we haven't yet acknowledged it, we run the risk of filling that void with something far more terrifying. He writes, "What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently, the advent of nihilism." One of the great readers of Nietzsche, French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, sums it up in the following way. In the word nihilism, nihil does not signify non-being, but primarily a value of nil. Life takes on a value of nil insofar as it is denied and depreciated. Bad times are a-comin', according to Nietzsche. And when we look at the first half of the 20th century, the excess of the Roaring Twenties followed by the Great Depression, the advent of worldwide warfare, chemical weapons, the rise of fascism, the concentration camp, the atomic bomb. I told you this was going to be a sunny talk, right? The atomic bomb. It's difficult not to think that Nietzsche might have been onto something. I said earlier that Seven is a film that stares directly into the face of this problem, a world in which life is assigned the value of nil. That it deals unflinchingly with the question of nihilism, of whether and how and where we might look for hope or purpose in a world that seems so obviously bereft. Its premise is simple enough. A fanatic known only as John Doe, driven by a perverse interpretation of Christian morality and convinced of the utter irredeemability of humanity, begins targeting individuals for murder on the basis of their being, on his view, profoundly guilty of one of Pope Gregory's 7 deadly sins. But his method is not simply to kill them or even simply to torture them, but rather in a mode reminiscent of Dante's Inferno, to entrap them in such a way as to force them to carry the logic of their sin to its terminus, to push their sin to the point of their own demise, literalizing in the physical realm the death that the sin represents in the spiritual realm, to demonstrate literally that the wages of sin is death. The gluttony victim, a morbidly obese man, is forced to eat himself to death. The greed victim, a prominent defense attorney, is forced to enact a collateral demanded by Shylock in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice by cutting away a pound of his own flesh, and so on. The movie poster tagline read, 7 deadly sins, 7 ways to die. But Doe's vision is not completed in an entirely isomorphic fashion, as we know from the shocking twist ending. That is to say, not all of his victims are dispatched according to the same model, where the sin is turned against the sinner. Rather, he completes the vision in a truly diabolical manner. In a moment saturated with tragic significance, Detective David Mills, acting from the very passion that informs his idealism, and perhaps echoing the reckless passion of the biblical David, unwittingly reveals his name to John Doe, who poses as a photographer and accosts the detectives in the stairwell outside the scene of the sloth victim. Mills thus inadvertently empowers Doe to locate Mills' wife Tracy, whom he murders, setting up the detectives to discover the final revelation in the desert. Doe's sin of envy for, as he says, the simple life of Mills results deliberately in his own execution by Mills, who acts out of the very same wrath that compelled him to disclose his identity to Doe in the first place. Mills is destroyed by his wrath, first in making possible the murder of Tracy, and then in executing judgment on Doe for his sin of envy. Doe thus manages not only to complete his vision, but rather to break the film's emissary of hope, as it is Mills who still believes in the cause of justice, where Detective Somerset has long since given up on this hope. When the film ends, the villain has won. His project is completed, and not by himself alone, but with the help of the legal order embodied in Mills, the very forces enlisted to bring him to justice. Tracy, David's wife and the one indisputably innocent person in the film, even by Doe's standards when he's talking about his other victims. Tracy is dead. Her unborn child, signifying the very possibility of futurity and hope, never reaches fruition. And Mills, whose idealistic view of justice has led him into the very heart of darkness, has been morally broken. When the end credits begin to David Bowie's The Heart's Filthy Lesson, there lingers an undeniable heaviness. The world, as presented in Fincher 7, seems hopelessly dark, and we're left asking whether there's any goodness to be found in the world, any reason to hope. It almost seems superfluous to point out that Doe's vision of the world is a nihilistic one in precisely the sense that Nietzsche describes. Doe's vision is driven entirely by a mode of evaluation rooted in an ideal realm against which the world can only ever appear deficient. And when carried to its extreme terminus, this deficiency can foster a contempt so pernicious that life is assigned a value of nil. Doe's every creative act is an act of destruction. Every affirmation, a negation of life, based upon his appraisal that human existence is in its entirety irredeemably saturated with evil. Moreover, inasmuch as Doe draws his inspiration from the Western canon, the Bible, Pope Gregory I, St. Thomas Aquinas, Dante Alighieri, John Milton, Shakespeare, etc., Doe reinforces Nietzsche's assessment that nihilism lies at the core of the values of Western culture. Now, Fincher gives us several indications that this confrontation with the threat of nihilism is precisely his intent. The true conflict in the film is not so much the legal conflict between the forces of justice and the forces of criminality, as it is the philosophical conflict between Doe and Somerset, where Doe acts as the most concentrated expression of the darkness that Somerset has long believed characterized this world. And the one and only scene where we see Doe in the wild, as it were, not performing his character, when he's returning to his apartment building, he even mirrors the appearance of Somerset. Like Somerset, Doe understands the world as shot through with evil. We are not what was intended, he writes in his journals. But where Doe responds to this world with annihilative violence, Somerset's chosen response is resignation, both spiritually and literally, as he's preparing to leave the job and the city. Doe thus presents to Somerset the most complete test of how deeply his own commitment to resignation goes, a challenge in which Mills plays an important role. This confrontation is made transparent in 3 specific conversations that take place in the film. The first of these follows the discovery of the fingerprints at the site of the Greed murder, when Mills and Somerset are awaiting the results of the fingerprint analysis. And I will say, despite how dark this movie is, there are some kind of comical scenes, and the one right before this one, is kind of cute. Their little tense back and forth, their odd couple dynamic is kind of funny sometimes. Somerset follows up on Mills' assurances to Gould's wife that her husband's murderer would be brought to justice. Where Mills is convinced that they will indeed catch him, Somerset characterizes their work as one of bookkeeping and cataloging, a futile, box-checking exercise of dotting I's and crossing T's. So many corpses roll away unrevenged, he says. The second of these conversations takes place in the bar, just after the lust victim has been found and all associated parties have been interrogated. Somerset once again asserts to Mills that this isn't going to have a happy ending, reaffirming his doubt that they will ever actually capture John Doe. And even if they do, it will not change the fact that this is no supernatural entity that is committing these acts, but, he says, just a man. And the central fact that John Doe's acts are representations of the things that human beings are capable of. Even if we manage to catch him, we will not vanquish the evil that he represents. That evil will not go away just because Doe is caught. Mills' efforts will ultimately come to naught, and in the end, no one's going to care. People don't want a champion. They want to eat cheeseburgers, play the lotto, and watch television. Somerset sympathizes with the pervasive cultural apathy, noting that, he says, love costs. It takes effort, work. Somerset, as we see, sleeps to the sound of a metronome used to distract him from the sounds of the city. Nonetheless, this apathy and the evil that it shelters and abides have become intolerable for him. This is why he's leaving the job and ultimately the city. In Andrew Kevin Walker's screenplay, there is a prologue to the film in which Somerset is looking at a country house that he intends to buy, using his switchblade to cut a sample of the wallpaper to take and carry with him, a talisman of his very own promised land. Leaving in this discussion represents for Mills a willful averting of one's moral sensibilities, a withdrawal, just as in the parable of the Good Samaritan, the priest and the Levite cross the street to avoid encountering the man who lies half dead in the street. Mills retorts to Somerset, I don't think you're quitting because you believe these things you say. I think you want to believe them because you're quitting. I don't agree with you. I do not. I can't. The common feature connecting these two conversations is that in both cases, the conversation is launched by Somerset, expressing a provocative opinion to Mills in an effort to bait him into this very conversation on the question of hope. Somerset, it seems, desperately wants to hope, wants something to believe in, and where he had almost succeeded in silencing that need forever, Mills' intrusion into his life has challenged his sense of resignation. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we have the diner conversation between Somerset and Mills' wife, Tracy, in which she reveals her pregnancy to Somerset, along with the fact that she has not yet informed Mills of this pregnancy. This conversation, nestled almost exactly in the halfway point of the film, is crucial for two reasons. First, we see Somerset at his most real. He has dropped his performance of the role of the elder sage of the police force, and Tracy has drawn out of him a pure humanity that we had not really seen. We see him at his most vulnerable, and in that vulnerability we see undeniably a vacillation between his desire for hope and his certainty that there is no empirical justification for such hope. Second, it is the one scene in which explicit reflection is offered on the nature of hope. The unborn child in this scenario functions as a sign of an unknowable future, and Tracy's anguish is grounded in the question of whether or not we ought to hope in that future given the world we live in. To bring a child into the world is inherently an act of hope, and that hope is itself rooted in paradox. We bring forth a life for which we are infinitely responsible, knowing full well to the core of our being that we cannot ultimately protect it. Anyone who has ever had a child is deeply familiar with this paradox. This is further reinforced by Somerset's revelation that he too had once been in a committed romantic partnership, that his partner had gotten pregnant, and that he had gradually convinced her to terminate the pregnancy on the ground that it is irresponsible to bring life into such a world. He's describing, the day after he finds out she's pregnant. He says, "And I felt this fear for the first time ever. I remember thinking, how can I bring a child into a world like this? How can a person grow up with all this around them? I told her I didn't want her to have it, and over the next few weeks I wore her down." He goes on to say, "I'm positive that I made the right decision, but there's not a day that passes that I don't wish that I had made a different choice." His choice in this case is not the choice of whether or not to keep the child, as that would have been a choice made by his partner, but rather his choice as to whether or not to affirm the hope that is required to parent a child in the first place. And he encourages Tracy that should she choose to bear her child, she should, he says, spoil that child every chance you get. Like a bolt of lightning, Doe erupts into Somerset's malaise. This is evidenced in a key moment in the film's beginning. Just after the first time that we see Somerset activate his metronome at the end of the first day of the film, silencing the world so that he can drift off to sleep, the screen goes black to the sound of crashing thunder. Before we cut to the incredible opening title sequence, scored by a remix of the Nine Inch Nails song Closer, ending the sequence with the line, "You get me closer to God." As we've intimated from the beginning, Doe's character is inherently tied up with the unfolding of the narrative. His conception of self, I suggested earlier, is a kenotic one. The term kenosis comes from the Greek and signifies emptying, and it's found in Philippians chapter 2, where Paul encourages the believer to empty themselves in the way that Christ emptied himself when, despite being one with the Father, he sacrificed himself, first into the form of a servant, and ultimately in his crucifixion. Christ emptied himself of himself, making himself a pure conduit of the divine will. On the night before his crucifixion, his dark night of the soul in the garden, Christ prays, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will but yours be done." The Christian conception of kenosis has much in common with forms of ego death that we find in other religions. But in Christianity, this ethic is literally and physically embodied in the personhood, life, death, and resurrection of Christ. And this ethic is expressed elsewhere in the New Testament and in the rituals of the church. In his first letter to the Corinthians, for instance, Paul claims, "I die every day." In John's Gospel, we see John the Baptist as his own ministry is waning and making way for that of Jesus, claiming, "He must increase, but I must decrease." And the very ritual of baptism signifies the death of the former self and the rebirth of the self in Christ through the physical commemoration of the death and resurrection of Christ. It is clear that Doe's conception of himself is bound up in this kenotic ethos, that he sees himself as merely an empty vessel for the will of the divine. During the trip into the desert, when Somerset asks Doe who he really is, Doe responds, "It doesn't matter who I am. Who I am means absolutely nothing." When Mills asks him what makes him so special that people should listen to him, he responds, "I'm not special. I've never been exceptional. This is, though, what I'm doing, my work." When Mills mocks him as obviously insane, Doe responds, "It's not something I would expect you to accept, but I did not choose. I was chosen." Doe has negated in himself every mark of his individual identity, his history, his name, even his fingerprints, so that he may decrease, so that God may increase and enact his will in him. He sees himself as a latter-day prophet with a pious acumen, willing to engage in the unsavory but necessary labor of divine instruction. His life-denying nihilism is a corollary of this kenotic conception of self. Now, when I say that this nihilism ultimately fails, I want to be clear. I don't wish to say that the film is not really as dark as it seems. No, it absolutely is. In his Rolling Stone review of the film, Peter Travers notes that Seven wants to abrade, not ingratiate. In the pre-production stages, the studio pressed hard for Fincher to temper the bleakness of Walker's ending. But thankfully, Fincher, still stinging from the critical and popular failure of his first film, in my opinion, the criminally underrated Alien 3, which he felt had resulted largely from the strong-arming interferences of the studio. So Fincher refused. Either I film it as it's written or I don't film it at all. And as I mentioned earlier, the film pulls no punches in its confrontation with nihilism. So then how does it fail? Its ultimate failure is revealed, if cryptically, in the film's final act. As Mills and Somerset return to the police precinct following the investigation at the scene of the Vanity murder, we see the sun shining for the first time in the film, and it continues to shine for the remainder of the film. We're called back to Somerset's discovery of the Milton quote hanging behind the refrigerator at the home of the gluttony murder in the film's beginnings. "Long is the way and hard that out of hell leads up to light." We've been led up to the light. By this point, we have spent the entire film shrouded in darkness, and now we are on the cusp of revelation. In a certain sense, this is obvious. Thank you to AI. I just found this. I didn't. In a certain sense, this is obvious, as we are about to reach the culmination of Doe's sadistic vision, embodied, literally, in the box containing Tracy's severed head. But more significant than this brutal artifact is the crucial light that it sheds on Doe's character. Doe has, to this point, presented himself as a kenotic martyr, devoid of ego and anointed by God to carry out the work of divine judgment. But the shocking revelation of his murder of Tracy, rooted, he claims, in his sin of envy, suggests something else entirely. Namely, that Doe is himself an example of the very rancidity that saturates his view of humanity. Doe's all-consuming nihilism is not rooted in righteous indignation, as he himself seems to believe, but is a manifestation and expression of his own spiritual corruption, his own vicious nature. Stephen Mulhall points out that in a certain sense it is necessary that Doe not be exempt from his own diagnosis of the pervasiveness of sin, given, of course, that the doctrine of original sin leaves no one untouched. But Doe is not simply acknowledging his own sinfulness. Rather, he is so completely consumed with envy that he destroys even the innocent. His final act is not one of turning sin against the sinner, as he says, but rather of stamping out the film's single image of goodness, Tracy and her unborn child, and with them, the idealism of Mills. It is not that there is no goodness in the world that Doe despises. Rather, he is so spiritually empty that the good that does exist is intolerable to him. Tracy dies not because of the ubiquitous wickedness of a worldly U.S. culture, but because of the envious loathing of Doe himself. His contempt for humanity, then, reveals more about Doe than it does the world. Prior to the revelation of the contents of the box, the shots of Doe in the desert tend to be from above or from eye level. That's the top one there, right? We see several shots of, cutting back and forth, and every time it's either head on or it's kind of from above. But following the revelation, the shot is from below. Doe is not a kenotic servant at all. He sees himself rather as above the fray. This is reinforced by the single excerpt from Doe's journals read aloud by Somerset, in which Doe describes a human interaction in which he vomits upon a chatty man in the subway, out of Doe's contempt for what he refers to as the man's banality. Doe's self-indulgent journals are filled not with the self-disciplining introspection of the Stoics, or with the prayerful reverence of Augustine's Confessions, but with egomaniacal and deep-seated loathing for his fellow human beings. The second indication of this failure lies in the transformation that we see in the character of Somerset. Following the bar conversation with Mills, as Somerset is lying down to sleep, we see him angrily destroy his metronome, the device that had served as a buffer. There's a ding, 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 a buffer between him and the world. The next morning, Somerset asks for Mills' permission to postpone his retirement until the Doe case has reached its end. And following the film's climax, Somerset suggests to the captain that he has had a change of heart about leaving after all. Somerset's resignation as a response to human suffering finds its greatest challenge in the connection he forms with David and Tracy, a connection which concretizes and personalizes for him the human impact of evil. This reality is jarring, and the only way to avoid it is to deaden or anesthetize the humanity within us. Otherwise, we are compelled to resist this evil. And through subtle illusion, the film gestures in the direction of hope. In the bar conversation with Mills, Somerset exclaims, in opposition to the resignation that he espouses, that love costs. It takes work, effort, and at this point in the film, it seems evident that Somerset has lost the willingness to exert that effort. But here, Somerset alludes to it as the alternative response to the human condition. Then earlier in the film, as Somerset is researching the likely literary sources of Doe's design, we see him copy a pictographic representation of Dante's Purgatorio. We see, briefly, the 7 deadly sins, characterized as perversions of love, whether through excess, deficiency, or misdirection. In the 17th canto of Purgatorio, Dante, speaking through the mouth of Virgil, writes, "That you may understand more clearly, pay close attention, then you shall pluck some good fruit from our stay. Neither Creator nor his creature, my dear son, was ever without love, whether natural or of the mind," he began. "And this you know, the natural is always without error, but the other may err in its chosen goal or through excessive or deficient vigor. While it is directed to the primal good, knowing moderation in its lesser goals, it cannot be the cause of wrongful pleasure. But when it bends to evil or pursues the good with more or less concern than needed, then the creature works against his maker. From this you surely understand that love must be the seed in you of every virtue and of every deed that merits punishment. At the core of even the most wretched evil lie the seeds of redemption, the love of the divine, the wellspring of all life and all creation. Thus I will close with a brief remark on a more complete sense of kenosis, I guess. On Doe's understanding, the kenotic ethic demands the death of the self, a gesture that Doe literalizes in luring Mills to execute him. But as we saw, his kenotic ethos is in fact an expression of a vicious ego. Doe's vision of kenosis ignores a key component of the Christian narrative, namely the resurrection. We die to the egoistic conception of the self so that we may be born in the love of God. In his Works of Love, Kierkegaard writes that to love God is to love oneself in truth. The key is not to become no one, but rather to become precisely the person that we are, as empowered by that love. Not to become nameless, but to assume for ourselves the very name dictated by that divine love. From Abram to Abraham, Jacob to Israel, Simon to Peter, and Saul to Paul. The darkest darkness contains within it the embers of that love that is capable of transforming us and through us the world. And it is here that hope is found. Early in this talk I said that Seven is a film about negation. But this applies also to the hope for hope that lies hidden in the film. The film does not provide this hope for us. For hope that is seen is not hope. Rather, it challenges us to seek that hope in spite of the darkness. The heart's filthy lesson that Seven offers is to push Doe's nihilism to its limit, so that we might affirm that though this hope will never be comfortable or easy, it is precisely for this reason that we must never let it go. Thank you.
Questions, comments?
Oh, sorry. Huh.
Yeah, I have many thoughts, but I asked one question on the very end, like, towards the end of the movie. If I remember it rightly, Brad Pitt, he's just in a police car,
Yeah.
and he's committed the crime, and he's manifested the sin of wrath.
Right.
It's not clear what happens to him. He doesn't die, right? So
Right.
there's something significant there. All the other sins ends in death, but that one doesn't. So
Right.
he is then, the point then is he's to continue living out the nihilism for the rest of his life. Do you think that's implicit at the end? Is there something to that?
That he's,
Unique about
he's
wrath?
condemned to, I suppose, I don't know, it's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, he's rolling up in the police car. He's rolling by Mills Somerset and the captain, and Somerset says whatever he needs, and the captain says we'll take care of him.
Yeah.
I suppose that one might hope that he would eventually find hope again. That would be the ultimate hope. But in a sense, I mean, Doe has certainly tried to condemn him to that fate, it seems. I think that's fair. Does that answer your question, or is there more that you want to unpack?
I don't know if there's something unique about the sin of wrath compared to the others, according to the interpretation of the movie.
It is, like I said earlier in the talk, they're not isomorphic. It's not just turning the sin against the sinner, although in a way he does turn it against Mills, because it is Mills' wrath that ultimately leads him to Tracy and leads him to kill Doe. So it destroys him in one sense, but not in the literal sense that all the rest of them have been destroyed. So I think that's fair, yeah.
Well, but like you said, I mean, Tracy is hope and she is innocent. And so in place of Mills dying, Tracy is the sacrificial lamb.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Whoa. Yeah.
Well, just a comment on the kenosis. So if you read that passage again, where it says he emptied himself,
Yeah.
and then it goes on to explain what the emptying is. The emptying is a taking on of human nature.
Mm-hmm.
So people often present Christ loses, or the Son of God loses, he leaves the glory of heaven, right? Or he's no longer omnipotent or something like that. In fact, that's not the Orthodox Christian belief. Christ is fully still God after his incarnation, and he's fully human now. So the emptying is this willingness to take on, to take something on.
Mm-hmm.
And he does it out of affirming the value of human life, even in its state after fall.
Right.
And so the way you've articulated Doe's project reminds me of how, like, I think there's a Jesuit saying, like, where God builds a church, the devil builds a chapel.
Uh-huh.
Like, the devil is always mimicking the works of God, but it's always defective. And so that seems like the point that you've made, that he tells himself this is about justice,
Right.
but it's a perversion of
Yeah.
justice.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's like it's all about self-emptying, but he loses sight of the fact that the emptying of the Son of God was an assumption of human nature for the sake of saving human nature, not for the sake of destroying it.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a great point. Did I say anything that you found, problematic, or are you?
I can't remember anything exactly specific, right at the moment. There were one or two places where I thought, like, I might want to tweak the precision of it, but I'd have to look at the text again to remind myself. But I just thought, like, I wanted to throw that out there because it seems to align with what you're talking about, how what he's doing in his own mind is, he's not achieving what he's doing in his own mind.
Right.
Because of it. Even if he thinks, like, oh, I'm being super Christ-like and I'm the justice of God, in this world, and this is my vocation, he's clearly not doing that because his understanding of kenosis is all wrong, his understanding of coming to Christ and God's judgment is all wrong.
Yeah.
And I mean, actually, I know someone who works closely with exorcists, and he says, like, this is like very kind of common problem with people who are like involved in or somehow connected into the demonic. There's a twisting of some good, and that they think, that they're pursuing something that's good, when in fact it's actually very twisted away from the good.
Yeah. Which reminds me of Kierkegaard as well, who's like the demonic is the one who recognizes the paradox and rejects it in some way. So yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Do you think this is an anti-Catholic film?
Right, this is an anti-Catholic film. Can you say more about what's motivating the question?
Oh, sure. I love this film. Always have. Fincher, famous atheist. I would imagine the popular imagination, people who would have watched this movie in the 1990s might have seen the character of John Doe as a probably popular view of Catholics who take faith too far into the
I see.
to judgment on or pain of others.
Well, I think it's interesting that sometimes these directors who are literary authors or whatever, who are professing atheists, are deeply interested in the questions, right? And wrestle like aggressively. One of the reasons that I love Nietzsche is precisely because he wrestles so deliberately with it. He's very intent on wrestling with it. He's not just dismissive at all, right? And I think that Fincher, there are a lot of. It's been a long time since I've seen Alien 3, but it seems to me there are a number of sort of Christian images if I'm not mistaken, as Ripley is falling backwards, her arms go out in a sort of Christ crucifixion sort of pose. And so there are, it seems like there are a number of images there. So I don't know that I'd say it's anti-Catholic or anti-Christian, although it might point to some of the dangers of some of what fanaticism can do. But, I mean, like, I end up sort of like finding a little kernel of faith, kind of, or something looking like faith kind of hiding in there. So I think it's certainly wrestling with it, for sure, but I don't know that I would say it's anti-Catholic or Christian. Yeah, Joel.
Maybe to kind of piggyback off that and ask you a question. Something about the difference between Somerset and Mills is Somerset's willingness to read.
Yeah.
Like, he goes to the library and he's familiar with these texts and he's delving into Dante and Milton, the firsthand basis, whereas Mills would be the guy who's using ChatGPT nowadays.
Yeah, for sure.
We're just kind of skipping through the process.
Right.
And Somerset, as far as I remember, wears a cross, similar to what you're wearing right now.
Does he?
Has this
That
kind
might
of
be.
like, he's not like overtly Christian in
Right.
the sense of like, yes, we don't see him going to church or mass
Right.
or anything like that. But he knows his tradition and he knows theology and he seems to know scripture in a way that, I guess I would wonder if that would also be a hopeful part of this too. That there's something about his own formation and Mill's lack of formation.
Yeah.
Even in kind of their habituation and the disciplines that they've chosen. Like Somerset is a very disciplined, he's a reader, he's a thinker, and the long, slow path, right, that's leading to light. And Mills is like just jumping ahead, right, and like impulsive.
Yeah.
He's not reading, he's not
That's
thinking
true.
about those things, or immersing himself in a tradition in that way.
Yeah. So it's really interesting because on the one hand, like Mills is the person who has this sort of naively idealistic view, right? That, oh yeah, of course we're going to catch the guy. This is what we do. We catch the bad guys. We bring bad guys to justice. He just sort of, in a kind of naive way. And there are all these moments, some of the, I mentioned the funnier moments. There are the moments when Somerset's kind of on his soapbox about how much everything sucks, and Mills is just sitting there like rolling his eyes like, oh my God, here we go again. And it's kind of funny the way that plays out. But so Mills is the sort of naively optimistic idealist in a certain sense. But then when it comes to like his approach to the crimes, he's looking strictly at the material. Like he's focusing on the images. He dismisses Doe's brilliance. Oh, just because he has a library card, that doesn't make him Yoda, which is also a really funny line. So on the one hand, it's like he's got this sort of naive hopeful optimism or something like this, idealism. But then he's also, like you said, not the guy who's spending the time in the library doing the work. He's looking at the images themselves. He's just trying to read the text of the crimes. But then on the flip side, you have Somerset, who is very much immersed in the tradition, knows the tradition, goes to the library, does all of the book work, but then is also, pessimistic when it comes to where hope might be found. So you said you had a question too. Was there a question?
Yeah, I guess like I was curious if that would be a part of this hope project that you're trying to discern at least like a small bit of hope there. So maybe if Mills has an optimism that's really grounded on very little.
Yeah, it is. It's
whereas, Somerset by the end, and even with, I'm glad you ended with this quote here, right? That I agree with the second part. Like,
Yeah.
so he is going to continue to fight for something. There is some sort of, not optimism, but hope that he can make a difference, or that a difference can be made on some level.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Yeah. David, yeah.
Actually, I want to piggyback on Joel's comment, and Mills is not the kind of guy who goes to the library, and he's not formed, but in the scene right before they go to the apartment, well, not right before, it's a couple scenes before, Somerset actually takes him to the library. So yeah, we see him in the car, and he's got cliff notes, if I remember right.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting, I hadn't thought about this before, but Somerset, who is, we could say, he's not interested at all in forming Mills. And yet we see in that moment, he takes him to the library, and because he knows he's got those buddies there that are the guards at night, right? So they wander around and they find a lot of stuff, which then enables them to give the information to the FBI, which then allows them to find the apartment. So that's an interesting case of Somerset. I don't know, we could say Mills is reluctantly along for the ride and Somerset does all the work, except it's interesting that the film makes a point of showing that they are not in tandem, but in that case they're in tandem.
Yeah, that's also a really great scene. I mean, the scene where he takes him and introduces him, what's his name, Mark Paul, what the guy from Memento.
Oh, Mark Boone.
Mark Boone, yeah. And he's the FBI guy, and you know, he sits down and Somerset just hands him the wad of cash and he leaves, and Mills is just sitting there like this. It's great. Yeah, so in that moment, they dive into the books in a sense to track the killer.
But I was noticing even more, that's the formation, that's a small piece of the formation that Mills lacks.
Yeah.
Somerset, you could see, I don't know, maybe it was just that he had Mills come along for the ride, or maybe he really is trying to say, if you want to do police work, this is how it's done.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Yeah, because, and right before that, Mills is like sitting there kind of complaining, like, why are we sitting in here? We should be out there doing something, you know, and then the library quote comes up, and that's what triggers to Somerset, oh yeah, this guy reads. And so, yeah, that's a really good point. That it's a sort of tutelage kind of moment. Yeah. A teaching moment, yeah. Oh, sorry.
First, a comment on the kind of hope thing going on.
Yeah.
I thought it's interesting that Brad Pitt's character seems to be more like optimism in a pejorative way, like wishful thinking.
Oh,
and then
interesting, yeah.
The idea that Somerset comes around to being somewhat hopeful, even though he has more of the learning. Usually it's like, if you're hopeful but uneducated, people think you're naive or stupid, and that's like a deficient kind of hope. But if you're hopeful despite knowing everything, because typically it's thought that you can hope even if it's the like 1% chance, as long as it's possible. So it seems like Somerset has a lot more information and is willing to hope despite that or something. And it's also thought that hope is unaloof, which is something you pointed out, that he like removes the metronome and he's no longer cynical. He's back, he's vulnerable again, like the reawakening of hope. So I thought just on a comment on that. But then a question for you about his sin seems to be, John Doe's sin seems to be envy in the movie.
Yeah.
But you use the Dante quote about love.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea that there's misdirected loves and like the worst sins are in there, envy, wrath, and pride. And when you showed the shot of him from below with like the sun behind him, and you read some of like his journals about how he's like really just complete contempt for all other people.
Yeah.
I got the sense more that his sin was pride, more than envy, but the movie explicitly says he's envy.
Yeah.
I wonder what you thought about how pride fits in there. And
Yeah, I
what it
was,
does to all of it.
the way I've sort of thought about it, and I almost used this in the talk, but I didn't, but that he's an embodiment of what Nietzsche calls ressentiment. I mean, he's just like, he's just saturated with this sort of contempt. And I suppose, like, he characterizes it as envy, but sure, I think there is a kind of pride about the way, you know, he does see himself as above everyone else, even if he acts as though he doesn't. He definitely does. And like, you know, I didn't show any of the other, like, there are a few times when we see the pages turning, there are a few little lines that you can pick up, and it's just all this sort of self-aggrandizing, you know, reflection. And, you know, he's got, what, 200 of these notebooks that he's written, you know, half line with, you know, filled up, and it's just, you know, his own reflections on himself. So I would be willing to say that. And yeah, I mean, I think that when I try to sort of flesh this out a little bit more, I'm going to work in that Nietzschean concept of ressentiment, because I think he's a pretty good example of it. I don't know if that answers your.
It does.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Oh yeah, hey.
Can I piggyback off that?
No, you can't. You cannot.
Well, you were brilliant.
Now we can.
That's but I kind of saw it as like John Doe reverse engineered it all, in that, yeah, he was prideful, but he's missing envy. So this is going to give him an in into getting the wrath. He knows he has the 7 deadly sins. He's already got pride taken care of, but envy is missing.
I see what you're saying.
He reverse engineered what his own sin is.
That's very possible. And so if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like you're kind of saying he's kind of shoehorning it in to sort of make it work.
He makes it work.
Yeah. That's possible too. Because even like you can hear a sort of triumphalism in his voice when he's like, seems that my sin is envy, so why don't you become wrath, buddy? You know, it's this kind of, you know, it is this kind of like, hey, look how clever I am. And so, yeah, I could certainly see that. I just think he's a vicious person through and through. Yeah, David.
I have to say, when you introduced the topic of kenosis, I was shocked because, well, I'll say one thing. I should have heard your paper before I wrote my paper for the seminar tomorrow, because it's about the demonic. And I think Doe is a demonic character, which means you pointed out, okay, he's self-aggrandizing. Well, that's kenotic.
No, not at all.
And I think there's something, I would say, you see in the journals, for example, contempt for humans. I think ultimately he's showing contempt for God and failing to enforce justice in this world that he sees. And so what does he do? It's almost like he commits crimes not to do God's will, even though he says that, I'm aware he says that. But it's a finger to God is really what he's doing. Like saying, if you exist at all, you're a creep. And I don't want anything to do with you.
So do you think of it as kind of like, well, do you think he's like saying, well, fine, if you're not going to take care of this,
I'll do it.
Then I will. Yeah, so that's kind of
saying, damn it, I'm God. I'll play the role because you're not.
So in that sense, that kind of reminds me of the Inquisitor in the Brothers K, in the sense that it's like, you left, go away, let us take care of it, but in a very, very different kind of way, it seems. But yeah, I think that's an interesting read. I'm looking forward to your paper. Anyone else?
Well, just to build on that same point as Dan was saying, because I was really struck by that framing of that shot where he stands up, right? Because he's got the sun behind him, it's almost like a halo, and his eyes are looking up. And it reminded me of like some crucifixes where, you know, Christ is looking up to the Father, right? So it does seem to be a kind of parody of like, now he's the Son of God, like affirming your interpretation about kenosis, but that's all like gone wrong. So it also reminded me like of the Garden of Eden, right, where the devil tempts Adam and Eve, you know, that, well, you will be like gods, know good and evil, right? And so he now set himself up as judge, jury, and executioner. He set himself up as God. He's become like God, right, to decide what's good and evil. Scripture also says, like, right, God says, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Like, your job is to have mercy as you receive mercy and be the judgment to me. But so again, it goes to that question, the demonic, like, and the evil, where you're seeking some good, but it's like always, it's a perverted thing. Like, it's been perverted so that you're doing evil under the guise of good, but and consequently not achieving good.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, and that goes to Daniel's point about pride, kind of as you know, shaping his entirety, the entirety of his being. And to David's point as well, that it's, you know, he's I'll take care of this myself. I will preach by way of these actions, and there's that line where he says, in another sort of, you know, self-aggrandizing moment, where he says, but what I am doing now will be studied and copied and discussed forever, right? You know,
there's humility.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Sorry, go ahead.
No. So I was going to make that point too. Like, I'm the most humble of all. Right?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So that his kenosis is like actually a matter of setting himself up as the new God who renders judgment.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I think that's right. Anthony.
I'm not sure what the difference is between pride and envy, but it sounds like if Doe is the embodiment of envy, it sounds like he's envious of God more than he is of.
Oh yeah, say more. What do you mean? And like,
he's supposed to be envious of Mills.
Right.
Family, but insofar as he wants to stand in the place of God, I mean, and it sounds very much like pride, too,
yeah.
but
It's also, I'm not so sure I buy this whole, I'm envious of your simple life.
right.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, he didn't even know this guy. You know, it's not like he's watching him from afar and he's like, oh, look at this perfect life that Mills has. It's and he even says, like, when they go to his apartment and he calls, right? He even says, I'm going to have to readjust my schedule in light of this little setback, which I take it that that's the moment when he decides how he's going to finish this out. So, I mean, I don't know that I buy that, you know, he's just consumed with this envy for David Mills. You know, it's just, he's just a vicious person. And even the characterization of Mills' life as the simple life is itself a sort of, arrogant, elitist kind of, oh, you know, look at me, the monastic saint, you know, frittering away with my books in my dark apartment. I wish I could just taste the simple life, you know, of, you know, the simpleton who, you know, goes to work every day and comes home to his loving wife, right? I don't know. It's just wretchedness. It's just viciousness that I almost feel like he uses that notion of envy, my envy of your simple life, as just like as an excuse, even if that's the way he characterizes it. It's just like an excuse to, you know, to enact this, to finish this vision.
Or it's more bullshit to provoke Mills into doing what he does.
Yeah.
I think when you mentioned about resentment, I totally agree on that. How probably Nietzsche and like the idea of help us understand Joe Dewey as a character. But at the same time, I was wondering if you see what Joe Dewey was doing is a kind of Nietzsche move in terms of like transvaluation of all values.
I don't think so. I think I would see him as just a manifestation of a kind of slave morality, as a kind of his need to enact his moralistic view of the world to the point that he is willing to commit these unspeakable acts against people, against human beings. I think I see him more in that register, but do you want to say more about like the transvaluation stuff?
I feel like although it seems that he's like murder, I feel like his murder is kind of making fun of, or it's more like an irony of the seven sins, but he's trying to, you know, he kind of adopted kind of like norms or values, but in a way of like overthrowing them.
Overthrowing them, how? By taking them into his own hands, you mean?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So he's kind of like manipulated those like norms or values for like self-aggrandizement or like
yeah.
Maybe I see him more like not as like hubristic as like I can do what God did, but I'm even like better or superior than God.
That's probably true, and yet he doesn't think of it that way. I don't think, right? I think he thinks that he's doing the Lord's work,
Right.
And so I think that the way Nietzsche would think of it is that obsession with that idealized framework has twisted him in a sense, or something like this. And so, yeah, I don't think I would want to say that he's an agent of the transvaluation of values. I would say he's and this is something else I'd like to do when I unpack when I flesh this out a little bit more, is I'd like to go into more depth on what kind of nihilism it is that he's espousing. because there are various, flavors of nihilism, even by Nietzsche's standards. So I'd like to unpack that a little bit more. But I think I'm inclined to say that he's an agent of slave morality. That this transcendent code of values has, as he understands it, has twisted him to the point that he takes it upon himself to execute judgment upon the world. That's, I think I'd be at that. Yeah, Daniel.
I was wondering, I was thinking about the envy pride thing, and I'm wondering what you think about, it's not a deadly sin, but spite in like Notes from Underground.
Yeah.
It has both the connotation of wickedness within it, but also the self-reflexive jealousy, which seems to kind of capture both envy and the fact that it's self-reflexive is like this shame or insult is like captures the pride bit. And when we were talking through the journals, that seemed, it's like he's almost offended by their existence in some way. And obviously he has a lot of Notes from Underground kind of like writing in the, of course he's much more action focused and it's not played for laughs, like in the second half of Notes from Underground, much more demonic. He actually goes out in the world and does things.
True, but we don't know how long he's been monastically hiding in his apartment doing this too. So go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just wondering what you thought about that word and how it's used, like in the Notes from Underground, if that captures kind of the envy pride bridge.
It's interesting. Yeah, I think that's probably fair. And I've never thought about the connection to Notes from Underground, which I can't believe I haven't thought of that. But yeah, I don't. Okay, so you said bridging. So there's the jealousy, but also, what did you say? The jealousy, but also.
I was saying jealousy, but also like the self-reflective part that kind of captures the pride bit that says, oh, not only am I jealous of you, or you've insulted me, or I want what you have or something, but it's because I've been insulted, which is kind of insulted pride, which you have to have some sort of like standing in your own mind. Like the Underground Man has this crazy inflated view of himself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I'd need to think about that more, but I think it's a really good connection to make, for sure. Yeah, it's one might think of John Doe as what happens when the Underground Man has been at it for years and years and years and decides to take it upon himself to, venture out into the world.
I don't want to stop, but I think we've reached 8:30. Let's thank Vernon for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Super thought-provoking.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again.